evening, I'm Larry Lorenz. You can kick a person off a levee board, but that doesn't mean he still won't fight. That's the message from one former board member who continues his charge to sue big industry. Elsewhere, with all the local intrigue about the newspaper industry, someone should write a book. In fact, someone has. We'll hear about the remaking of the Times-Picayune. These stories, and we'll take a look at tomorrow's election and the congressional winners and losers in the government partial shutdown, are fodder for tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Bob Marshall, environmental reporter for The Lens. Rebecca Theim, author of the book Hell and High Water, The Battle to Save the Daily Times-Picayune. And Stephanie Grace, columnist for the New Orleans Advocate. And Stephanie, let's begin with this, recovering from the shutdown. But who is likely to recover and who lost in that?
Among our delegation,
yes.
It's interesting. There are, depends on what your definition of winning and losing is, I think, as usual. We have a very Republican delegation. The Democrats were fine. They held together. Maryland or Cedric Richmond, I think, are perfectly happy with how this came out. The Republicans are at each other a little bit. It's interesting. Charles Boustany made a little bit of made some waves, actually, after this thing ended. He's the congressman from the southwest part of the state, and he's the one who's probably closest to the speaker, John Boehner, so I think he was really channeling a lot of the frustration that the speaker felt not being able to have his caucus together to go cut a deal. And he basically lit into the, he didn't say Tea Party, but it's clear what he meant, the Tea Party faction of his party, and he said, I don't even know if these guys are real conservatives. I don't know if they're real Republicans. You know, we might lose the majority because of the way they behaved. And his office put out a press release that said Boustany votes to fund the government and open the government, basically. He's the only Republican who voted for the final bill in the whole Louisiana delegation. So, if you're a moderate and you're looking for some kind of common sense here, I think he's the winner. Some of the other members who fought this actually got a lot of publicity, so you could say they're winners too. John Fleming, who is actually both Boustany and Fleming are physicians, so it's interesting that they got very involved in this Obamacare fight. He ended up with an op-ed in USA Today. He was quoted very prominently in the New York Times, other places, basically saying, this was a good fight, we did the right thing, and we're coming back. David Vitter has been all over this, and he has an amendment. It's a little bit convoluted, but he's getting a lot of mileage out of it and probably angering a lot of congressional staffers and his fellow members, because what he's really going after is their right to employer-subsidized health care, the way most people who work for large organizations get. And it goes back to the fact that when the original Obamacare measure was passed, Republican Senator Charles Grassley basically said members of Congress and their staffs, they have to go on these exchanges that are being set up actually for people who don't have employer insurance. And it was kind of meant to be a poison pill, but they passed it anyway. So then, these people are ready to go on the exchanges, and the government has said that it will continue to pay the employer's share because it's insurance, just like, I get working for the Advocate. And David Vitter is calling that a special exemption, and he is railing to eliminate that. That was one of the amendments he tried to put on this spending bill, and Bill Cassidy, the congressman who's running for Senate, has signed on to it, and Steve Scalise has been talking about it. And it's interesting because John Boehner, there are some emails where it showed that he really has been fighting to keep that, and for good reason, I think. I mean, is it really fair to ask the people who work for you to take a big pay cut for your politics? Cassidy, I think, has had a little bit of a rough time because he's a Republican running against Mary Landrieu. He's also a physician, and he has a track record of being a little more moderate and actually supporting some Obamacare-like measures in the state when he was in the legislature. So he really had to kind of, to prove that he was enough of a conservative to conservatives, he had to really go all in on this, voting to, agreeing to shut down the government, in order to defund Obamacare. That's something he was, when the movement was building over the summer, he was really slow to get on board. I think he tried to kind of find a way out of this, and he couldn't. So he is now, gone in with the conservatives, but there are still conservatives out there saying, you know what, he's still not conservative enough for us. So he made nobody happy, I think.
So, all right. Well, nobody's happy.
Nobody's happy, but we have a government again. Yes.
Well, Bob, Governor Jindal refused to reappoint John Barry to this regional levee board, but John Barry is not going quietly.
He's not going away. He has pledged to continue his fight, which is basically to convince the oil and gas industry that they have to come forward and pay for the damage that they've done to the wetlands. He announced he was Thursday's meeting of the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East, on which he had sat for 7 years since it was first organized, officially replaced him yesterday with Joe Hasinger, who is a supporter of Governor Jindal's, and told Governor Jindal that he would not support the lawsuit if appointed. He had previously sat as president of the non-asset flood protection agency here in town. He's had to resign that. So John was at the meeting. He had actually said his farewells at the previous meeting, but he showed up and he put his card in to be a speaker. And he first thanked everyone with all the different levee districts for working. And he said, and I'm not going away. I'm going to be working to form a group who's a nonprofit whose main thrust will be to see this suit become a success. After the meeting and talking to him, after everything was over there, he fleshed it out a little bit more. The group has been being formed and talked about for several weeks. He wasn't part of that because ethically he couldn't be involved. But he said their main goal initially will be to go to the legislature and try to win this battle against Jindal, who has promised to use the lawmakers to basically gut the laws that have been previously written to keep politicians out of this whole process. And it's a shame that this happened the way it did. According to, Barry said his whole intention all along was to find some funding mechanism to help pay for the cost of flood protection here in this district and statewide. And he told the board in his farewell address that the facts haven't changed as far as he's concerned, and that the oil and gas industry is not responsible for all the damage, but they are responsible for some of it, 36% according to the USGS, as high as 50 or 70% according to various university studies. And he thinks that the state, if they go to the oil and gas industry and say, it's time for you to come forward, they will have to come forward. And so Governor Jindal wants to have the legislation that was written that created this independent political subdivision of the state, this levee authority in the wake of Katrina, and this nominating committee that nominates people for this board, and that committee is made of only professionals in engineering and good government groups. He has basically said that we're going to go in and redo that enabling legislation, because the constitutional amendment that passed that set up the flood authority would take too much trouble. So they're going to go in and take that apart and make sure that the governor has control over this process, and he can protect basically who he wants to.
Why is the governor so opposed to this? And apparently, from what I've read, many of the legislators.
Well, this is still an oil state. The oil industry, according to our figures, since the 1980s has spent well over $1.5 billion on races for Louisiana politicians, either in the state or for congressional and Senate races. They're still the big stick in the state. Even though most of their offices have moved, they employ a lot of people. And in fact, the Joint Legislative Committee on Transportation that writes this enabling legislation, there was a hearing, an informational hearing 2 weeks after the suit was filed in Baton Rouge. And the chairman of the committee owns an oil and gas company. And several members of the committee work in the oil and gas industry. So it wasn't a friendly audience. So, the oil and gas industry is big in the state, has been since the 1920s and remains so.
Are there any friendly legislators, do you think?
Well, I asked John that question. So what makes you think you can beat the governor at this game? And he said that people who are working on this have been counting votes, and they think it's closer than most people realize. And so that's why they're going to aim their lobbying efforts at, they say, bringing the facts, what they really want done, what the oil and gas industry is responsible for, and they want to prevent the legislature from stepping in and intervening in this lawsuit. The other thing Jindal wants to do is have the legislature pass some type of bill that would change the way even an independent political subdivision could go to court without the governor's permission.
Well, he's going to have his way come hell or high water.
Well, that's a good segue.
And
Very
Rebecca
nice segue.
Theim, you've done a new book, Hell and High Water. Where did you get the title for this?
Well, I think for most people who are familiar with the recent history of the Times-Picayune, they know what a tremendous role the Picayune and its staff played in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in informing and educating and advocating on behalf of the citizenry of New Orleans. And there was a very famous T-shirt that Stephanie and Bob and others of us own that the Picayune produced that says, "We published Come Hell and High Water," which was available immediately after Katrina. And a major character in the book is Katrina, and the way the newspaper became so beloved in the community because of the great service it paid to the community.
But you have quite a different T-shirt today.
I do. As part of doing the research for the book, I did interview many people off the record. I only had one person speak to me on the record from the newspaper or from Advance, who still is employed there, and that's environmental reporter Mark Schlefstein, with whom I worked when I was at the paper many years ago. And as part of my interview with Mark, he had offered to give me a tour of the new NOLA Media Group offices, which are, as many people here in the community know, on the top 2 floors of One Canal Place. And at the end of the interview, I asked Mark about my tour, and he said, "I've been told by management that you're not welcomed there." He would never tell me which management it was, but I can guess. So I thought the T-shirt was apropos, that I'm no longer welcomed in the offices of my former employer.
And along with that, you have a cartoon in the book that is rather stinging.
Yeah, actually, that was by the work of Errol, Laborde here in New Orleans Magazine. They commissioned former Times-Picayune editorial columnist Mike Lukovich, who is a multiple, I think, Pulitzer Prize winner, to do several cartoons dedicated to this issue last year that they ran in the magazine. And Mike was gracious enough to give me permission to reprint one of them in the book.
Well, the Grim Reaper there could well have been Mr. Newhouse coming down from New York to say that there were changes to be made at the Times-Picayune. You were here to see what happened there, were you not?
Well, I had been gone from actually working at the paper for many years. I left in 1994, but as anybody who knows New Orleans and the Times-Picayune knows how enduring relationships are, and I still counted many friends here. And when, I think probably in the aftermath of Katrina, like for many of us, when I thought that this beloved city that I had always hoped to return to was truly imperiled, I reconnected with many of those friends more significantly than they had been in the past. And I was following the history and what was going on with the paper ever since then. And of course, I was among the many of us who got that news alert on May 24th, 2012, where David Carr broke this story about the changes that were coming to the paper and the Newhouse's digital first foray into New Orleans, and next year and a half unfolded as it did and led to the book.
Why did the Newhouse people choose New Orleans? They've got newspapers all across the country. Why did they choose to start here with this dismantling, if you will?
Well, they actually did not start here. They started in 2009 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They own 8 newspapers in Michigan, and they started at the paper in Ann Arbor, probably for reasons, although, again, nobody from Advance spoke to me, so I'm basing it on what other people know and other people's postulations about what went on. That's a very transient, digital savvy community, home of the University of Michigan, and it apparently went well enough there and at the other Michigan papers of which they rolled it out to lead them to think that it would be a good idea elsewhere. And I was at LSU yesterday meeting with a number of the faculty members there, talking about the book and other things. And Jean Broussard, who's a former New Orleans City Hall press secretary, had interviewed Jim Amos for a book that the LSU faculty is putting together. in which he told her that the Picayune, if I'm quoting her properly, that the Picayune had sort of led the way with its Katrina coverage and the way it used the internet and NOLA.com to communicate information to folks as they were spread around the country after having evacuated. And the fact that they saw such tremendous traffic growth in the aftermath of the storm was what led the light bulb to go on somewhere in Advance's New York offices, that this might be a way we could go forward and presumably try to restore some of the incredible profit margins that their papers have reportedly enjoyed for many decades.
Many people in New Orleans wanted to buy the Times-Picayune, put it under local management, but the new houses just simply would not sell. Why not? Why wouldn't they? Why not just get rid of this newspaper and give it?
I understand that there were at least two serious offers, Tom Benson being one of them. The issue, I think, Larry, is that nobody really knows what the paper is worth anymore. Newspaper valuations across the country have fallen dramatically in the past decade, and I talked to some very savvy newspaper analysts for the book who told me that the value of the paper had dropped hundreds of millions of dollars in the past decade and a half.
And look what's happened in more recent sales. I mean, pennies on the dollar almost in Boston Globe, places like that. So
both of the Philly papers we were talking about earlier. And so the new houses perhaps, and again, they didn't speak to me, so a lot of this is just sort of educated guesstimations. We're looking at what their papers were worth a decade ago and looking at what they would likely get today. And if you are a follower of this and have followed the coverage, Columbia Journalism Review has done some very insightful coverage of it and has said that if they're even making $20 million a year with this dramatically reduced staff and cost structure that they have now, that's probably they would earn back the $60 million they likely could have gotten for the paper in 3 short years.
Well, they actually were making money. This is one of the few properties in the Advance chain that was actually making a profit. Our information, I think, was 5 to 8%. Even so, one reason they weren't going to sell was because they had a moneymaker. And I think it was also mentioned the fact that this paper has such a loyal readership that they can continue to make money, that they'd lose some, but the people were wedded to the paper, and they had a profit here, so they could make mistakes and still be earning, paying the bills, so to speak, where if they went to one of the other papers, certainly not the New York Star-Ledger that's been bleeding red ink for some time, they don't have anything to play with there. That was the other reason given to us at the time. So, but it was all speculation because nothing, and I think Stephen Newhouse mentioned some of those. He didn't mention the profit the paper was making, but that was the talk inside the building.
Rebecca, when they first started cutting back, and they started, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and then they went into Alabama, and there was very little reaction in those communities, and those were smaller newspapers, but New Orleans was where the battle lines were drawn, and there was a huge reaction in New Orleans. Since then, there's 2 other bigger papers they went after, Cleveland and the Oregonian in Portland. Do you think the reaction in New Orleans did anything to help the cause in Cleveland and in Portland? And in fact, haven't they given them a better deal in those cities than they did in New Orleans?
That's exactly right, Errol. They have. In both, actually in Syracuse too, which followed the Times-Picayune and, as you mentioned, the Alabama papers that got the same digital first treatment at the same time that the Picayune did in October of 2012. In Portland, in Syracuse, and in Cleveland, they continue to print the paper daily. They've cut back on their home delivery to, I believe, in all of those markets, either 3 or 4 days a week. But you can still get the paper if you're willing to go to the daily paper, not the TP Street version, the daily newspaper on the other days if you're willing to go to a newsstand.
And they still have a home-delivered Saturday paper, and so there are still 4 days in those communities where you have a home-delivered paper, whereas there are 3 days they're still doing the full paper but not delivering. So those communities got a better deal than New Orleans did.
And I think that it's completely safe to assume that one of the reasons that perhaps they did was the blowback that the new houses received here in New Orleans, and particularly the blowback from advertisers who still continue to value that print publication. And when it went away here, I spoke to 4 large advertisers in the Times-Picayune for the book, and all of them had cut back dramatically on what they were spending in advertising with the newspaper, either because they didn't like the signal that it was sending that we are now the largest U.S. City without a daily newspaper, or because the news publishing schedule didn't match what they needed to reach their customers through their advertising. So I think that, again, maybe New Orleans was the petri dish, and the other new house cities have benefited at least in not having the same level of draconian cutbacks in their communities as you all had here.
Well, Stephanie Grace, we have an election tomorrow, not likely to draw very many voters, however.
Correct. It's one of those strange election days when, just throw whatever on there. It depends on where you live.
Well, in the 5th District, it's a big election.
5th District, because it's a special.
Louisiana.
So basically, it's a time for amendments, millages, and special elections, and that's a special election because former Congressman now, Rodney Alexander, resigned, and he got out of town just before the government shut down, which probably made him pretty happy because he was one of the last of the Republican moderates. So there's a special election, wide open field, a lot of candidates. So it's the northeastern part of the state, dips all the way down to kind of the northern part of the Florida parishes, and we'll certainly have a runoff, and it could be 2 Republicans, it could be a Republican and a Democrat, and however that shakes out will certainly shape the race going forward in the runoff. Locally, there are some interesting elections in Orleans and Jefferson. In Jefferson, there's a juvenile court judgeship open. There are 4 candidates there. But kind of the interesting items are some millage renewals, which one for schools, one for water, and one for sewer. Normally routine, but parish government officials realized that last spring they had the bad luck of appearing on the same ballot as the bridge toll, the second election, after the first one was overturned. So it was a very low turnout election, and who turned out? People who wanted to vote no.
And in New Orleans, we have a vote to change the charter on the Sewage and Water Board.
Sewage and Water Board. So there are 2 charter change. One is really procedural. One is to eliminate some boards that don't really function anymore. The other is to change the Sewage and Water Board to, among other things, remove the 3 city council members who have historically sat on the Sewage and Water Board. This is something the mayor wants to do. Good government groups. There is an argument that they have trouble doing things like, as Sewage and Water Board members, they have trouble doing things that might come back to bite them in an election. I've seen this firsthand. I think that's true. It would also shorten the terms, professionalize some of the qualifications along the lines of the levee board, actually.
So using those kind of elections, the strategy for political leaders is to say very little about it.
Yes.
So only the chronic voters go out, and the chronic voters are more likely to vote yes.
They understand the chronic voters are getting mailings and phone calls, otherwise very little. There are some elections, there are some judgeship elections, there's a magistrate election with 3 candidates, and there's one of these wide open New Orleans elections for traffic court, which is a big plum because you make a lot of money, you can work part-time, and there are 8 candidates. It was funny, I had a friend in town, I was driving him around, he saw all the signs, and he said, I don't know what this traffic court thing is, but I want it. Because apparently it's good, and it is good.
Yes. I've been gone 20 years, and some things never change.
Well, Bob, we're getting to the end of the hurricane season, but there's still some concern about the levees. Are they ready to be to withstand a major hurricane?
The levees that are in place now are the strongest and best this area's ever had. They can certainly withstand the 100-year storm. The concern right now is armoring, which means basically getting the grass to grow on the protected side of the levee. If these things are overtopped and they're not armored, we saw what would happen during Katrina down in St. Bernard Parish and on the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway, where those levees were not armored and they were overtopped. That's the only place in the metro area really where Katrina overtopped levees, and they collapsed. And so that's a big issue right now. The other issue is the state's in a long, drawn-out fight with the Corps on when the state has to take over ownership of this system. And that will reflect in your millages, because that's how we pay for this thing. It's going to cost $34 million a year to operate and maintain. And in the decades ahead, they'll have to be raised. And that could go into the hundreds of millions, if not billions. And right now, no one knows who's going to pay for that.
Well, Errol, long before that happens, what do you see that we ought to look for?
Well, December 21st is the New Orleans Bowl, and the people there are really excited because they hope ULL comes back, who's been there the last 2 years, which is a big draw. There's a real possibility they'll be playing Tulane. It's been a long time since Tulane's been in the bowl game, which would be exciting. And so the combination of ULL and Tulane, that's what they're hoping for. And they're both on the edge of being bowl eligible right now.
Bob?
Well, there's a great water symposium tomorrow at the Wellness Center. And if you want to learn about why we're running out of fresh water, believe it or not, we live surrounded by water, but we're running out of fresh water. Starts at noon tomorrow.
Why are we running out of fresh water?
The whole country is running out of fresh water because we're using more than is there, it's produced. Here in New Orleans, obviously we have a lot of water coming down the Mississippi, but other people want that water, which could have serious consequences for us.
Rebecca?
Well, anybody who's interested in coming out, saying hello, and buying a copy of the book, I'm at Barnes & Noble Mandeville tomorrow from 11 to 1, and at Tiscatatasket in the French Quarter from 2 to 4, and at Barnes & Noble Metairie on Sunday from 1 to 3.
And you were signing books last night as well.
At Octavia.
But you haven't gotten writer's cramp yet.
Not yet, but I'm hoping to work on it. So come on out and I'll sign a book for you.
You should sign at One Canal Place. Just
Stephanie.
Well, Mayor Landrieu introduced his budget last week, as we knew he would, and one of the big questions was how he was going to pay for some of these items he had been talking about being very big burdens on the city. It turns out one of which is the consent decree for Orleans Parish Prison. What he did is he budgeted $0 for that, and he's now punting it to the city council and asking them to come up with a plan. And the hearings before the council start this week, so that'll be pretty interesting.
What do the people on the council say about this?
We haven't heard from them yet.
You haven't talked to them privately?
No.
All right.
There's some surplus money that could be moved. There are a lot of moving parts to this. There's a federal judge involved. There are real questions of how much the parish prison really needs. There's a lot going on. And an election for sheriff in the middle of it all. So.
Yes, that's right, Charlie Fody.
Come
back of Charlie Fody.
Yes.
We'll have to come back.
A blast from the past.
Yes, it is.
We'll have to come back next week. Thanks all for being with us. Thank you for being with us on Informed Sources. Be back again next week. Good night.